whole talk about Arab Spring is an attempt by Britain, the US, the Western powers to put their own spin on what's happening in Africa or in other countries in what they call the Middle East, Western Asia and so on. And what they try to present is that this is somehow a movement. These movements are movements of people who want to be more like the West, who want multi-party democracies, who want free markets, and so on and so forth. So their presentation is that this Arab Spring is a movement for kind of westernization, modernization in their eyes, and so on. Actually, of course, it's not. The movements in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere were struggles precisely against the domination, intervention, interference of the big powers, US, Britain, France and others, who had propped up these reactionary governments for 30 years and so on. And of course the same is true in what they call the Middle East. They prop up these governments in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others and use them for their own purposes. So what they call the League of Arab States and so on, which is more or less their instrument in that region, is dominated by these reactionary feudal governments, which they support. They don't call for people to rise up in Saudi Arabia and there should be revolutions in Saudi. So it's complete hypocrisy. And as David Cameron said, the Arab Spring, as they call it, provides a great opportunity. So the opportunity for the governments of Britain and elsewhere is it gives them a space to again interfere in these countries, to divert the struggles of the people of those countries, not into channels which will satisfy the needs of the people, but into avenues which will benefit Britain, the US, France and the other big powers. Britain's foreign policy essentially is directed towards furthering the interests of, we can say, the rich and powerful, the big monopolies, the big financial institutions. So safeguarding their interests, both their interests in Britain and their interests overseas. So that means, in the context of the Scramble, that means that Britain is involved in the Scramble. Cameron calls it the Great Race, and he sees that great race as going on internationally. And the great race is between, you could say, the old powers, we could say like Britain, or between Britain and the other old powers, the French, the US and so on. That's part of it, but more particularly the struggle, the contention between them and the rising powers, the BRICS, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, and Russia and others. So the British government is trying to position itself to be in the best position in that so-called great race, in its contention with these other powers. Of course, they have particular areas of interest. One of those particular areas of interest is, at the moment, is Africa, and another is Asia. And of course, they have different and particular concerns in each. One of their big concerns is China, and both competing with China and, you could say, outflanking China in Asia, but competing with China in the rest of the world. And for that, Britain sometimes allies with others, with the French, with the US, and so on. And so we see British intervention in Africa in that light. So their intervention in Mali, they've attempted to intervene in areas which are not their traditional preserve. For example, in Algeria, where Cameron visited recently, in Mauritania, where they've never had strong relations, which a British foreign minister visited, I think, a year ago. Of course, their intervention has already taken place in Sierra Leone, they're Britain's first colony in Africa. They're very strongly involved in Democratic Republic of Congo. They're very much intervening in Somalia, which the Prime Minister says is his personal project, coincidentally where again massive new oil fields have been discovered just off the coast of Somalia. So suddenly Somalia's Cameron's favourite country. So their intervention is part of that great race, part of that scramble that's going on in Africa, but again in the interests of the big multinationals, the big financial institutions and so on. Of course, if we look at how it links with austerity in Britain, I mean, again, the economy is geared to essentially to paying the rich. It's so everything is geared to making maximum profits for the rich. So that may be cutting down on various things, paying off the deficit, making sure the banks are paid first. It's increasing privatisation of health service and so on and so forth. It's anyway, one can go into all of these things, but the key thing is the rich must be paid. The economy is operating in that way. One interesting area which is not cut is what they call overseas aid. Although they call it overseas aid, we could see it as a subsidy, and in fact, some people talk of aid as subsidies. So it's essentially a subsidy to the big multinationals. They provide X amount of money for a particular country. That country is expected to buy something from British Aerospace or one of the big monopolies here. And there are various infamous examples of how that works. A few years ago, there was the big scandal on the Tanzanian air traffic control system, which I think Claire Short resigned over, or anyway made a comment on, where X amount of aid was given to the Tanzanian government. Then it was pressured to buy an air traffic control system it didn't need because it just happened to be manufactured by, I think it was British Aerospace and so on. In other instances in the past, aid has been given to various countries and then pressure is put on them to privatise their utilities, particularly water supplies in Africa, and that privatisation is carried out by British companies or advised by British consultants and so on. So so-called aid goes straight from the taxpayer to the multinational company or the financial institution via the government of another country. And for that reason, it's not cut, because it's in the interests of the rich. So again, there are direct links. And again, I mean, one of the things that people always say is there's not money for health services, not money for education. But when it comes to dropping bombs on Libya or dropping bombs on some other country, there's no shortage of resources, no shortage of money and so on. Anyway, there's some truth in that, but I think it's also important to see whose interest these interventions serve, and that just as the austerity measures serve the interests of the few, so what could be called Britain's foreign policy also serves the interests of the few as well. The disinformation mainly comes from the so-called mass media or monopoly controlled media. And it is important to break through that disinformation. And of course, in the present periods, there are all kinds of means at our disposal, if you like, because there is the internet, there is an independent media, there are organisations, there is an anti-war movement. So there is the possibility of breaking through that disinformation. The other point is that even when disinformation has been enormous, as was the case leading up to the invasion of Iraq, 2 million people or whatever it was came out on the streets and so on. So in one sense you could say we shouldn't overrate the power of disinformation, and we should see that people also have understanding of what's going on. So the thing is to encourage that understanding, to provide the information which can be utilised by people. And I think generally it's the sentiment of people in the country being opposed to war and military intervention. With the, sometimes there's a little bit of confusion on various questions. On the question of Libya, for example, sometimes people get confused on the basis of what they think about the government that's in power and so on, which in a way is you could say almost a red herring, because the issue is to confront the crimes of the government of Britain and to settle scores with our government, in inverted commas, not to sort of pontificate about what the government of another country is like and whether that justifies Britain invading no, we should be opposed to the intervention by the British government, military intervention or other forms of intervention in other countries and any breach of sovereignty, and not get diverted by being concerned about what a particular government is like. That's a question for the people of that country, not for people here. Africans in Britain are connected to these events in two ways. One, you could say, very often there is a sympathy, sympathy is not the right way of looking at it, an opposition to any intervention which takes place in the African continent. People are concerned about what happens in Africa, and that's very important. At the second time, Africans in Britain should be and are concerned about what the government of Britain is doing, whether it's in Africa or it's somewhere else. I think what's important is that Africans in Britain involve themselves in the political movement, political activities which are going on in this country. And so if there's an anti-war movement, for example, then Africans should be involved in it, should be at the head of it, should be speaking and organising other Africans against the intervention of the British government in Africa, whether that's military intervention or economic intervention or any other form of intervention, and having no illusions, you could say, about the role that the British government plays in Africa. So I don't think it's just a question of Africans being concerned about their particular country of origin and so on. It's being concerned about and bringing their experiences and their knowledge to bear on the political movements that are going on in this country. And as I say, being involved in them, I think that's the most important thing. A successful anti-war movement in Britain would be a movement which ushers in an anti-war government. And at the moment we have a pro-war government, and we have, generally speaking, we have a pro-war parliament, which is to say there's a kind of Westminster consensus between all the big parties that military intervention is justified. Supporting military intervention or supporting other forms of intervention in Libya, in Mali, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan and so on is legitimate, and so on. So, and that's a reflection of, you could say, particular interests in Britain. An anti-war government, on the other hand, would be a government which would be opposed to any kind of military intervention of that kind, or creating the possibilities for intervention, or in any way operating in a way which is in opposition to peaceful relations between states in the world. And of course it would be a government which would remove British troops from being based outside Britain, and would make sure also there'd be no foreign troops, no foreign bases on the soil of Britain, which would remove itself from warmongering alliances like NATO and so on and so forth. I think the question is how to bring about that anti-war government, because clearly an anti-war government would be constituted and organised in a completely different way from the current government. So it necessitates really the people in the country who are the majority. In other words, the majority of people are against war, against military intervention. It necessitates the majority of people in the country empowering themselves in such a way that they constitute the government. And so that requires all kinds of things. It would require, for example, various forms of what we could call democratic renewal. It would require a different kind of political system. Because the political system we have at the moment is geared to producing political parties that represent a minority actually coming to power. So we'd need a political system where political parties don't come to power, but people are empowered. So it would mean, for example, as I say, making sure that political parties don't come to power, making sure that people have the right to select their candidates as well as to be elected, making sure that candidates are selected and elected from different types of constituencies, so from workplaces, from places of education, and so on. It would require a whole new political system in order to bring about an anti-war government. But it would also need a government which was geared to satisfying the interests, again, of the majority of people in the country, and particularly to those who are the major wealth creators. So at the moment we have governments that are not interested in the wealth creators, but interested in in those who accumulate the wealth. So we have a system where there's, whatever you call it, the national wealth is produced, and then the decision is made that somehow the millionaires and billionaires should take the lion's share of it. The government should then take another quite big share of it, and those who produced all the wealth will have whatever's left if they're fortunate, and so on. Not only for their wages, but also for their pensions and so on. So that also needs to be reversed. So we're talking about an entirely different economic system, an entirely different electoral system, political system, and so on. And for that to happen, it means first that people need to be conscious of the necessity for that to happen. So I think at the moment, many people are talking about an alternative political system, alternative economics, and so on. And I think it means having more discussions about what that actually does mean, and people being conscious of the need for anti-war government, alternative political system, alternative economic system. And then, of course, the ability to struggle for that change. If we take the example of the anti-war movement, the struggle of the anti-war movement isn't to put pressure on the government, or shouldn't be to put pressure on the government that maybe they're doing the wrong thing, and shouldn't they change their mind. The orientation of the anti-war movement should be to constitute themselves, if you like, an anti-war government, to actually empower themselves to become the decision makers in Britain. So that requires organisation and so on, but it also requires a different way of thinking about politics, political struggle, and so on. And when people have that consciousness, thinking, organisation, and put that together with the kind of struggles that we've seen, then you could say we'd be on the verge of anti-war government, pro-people government, people-centred government, not capital-centred, people-centred anti-war government, political system, economic system, and so on.